I want to talk a bit about how this hysteria that Sam and Leticia have spoken about in different contexts is playing out at the level of our national economies, our workplaces, and also our climate. Because one of the most important parts of this debate in the countries that I'm speaking about that are already militarized, that are already kind of these global military powers, is this question of our economies. We are told that there will be this thing called a defense dividend, that with these massive increases of military spending, we're going to see a boon for jobs and for economic growth. In the British context, this is particularly important because while here in Ireland you have a very progressively minded public on this question of neutrality, we have a different kind of situation with public opinion. And basically, military spending gets much more support in the polls if it is tied to this idea of jobs and growth. It gets much less support if it is tied to cuts to public services. And the reality that we know and we can see from the economic evidence is that military spending doesn't produce jobs and growth, that this idea of a so-called defense dividend is a lie, and as we're seeing now, cuts are being demanded in order to fund it. So to start with the kind of the more national and regional economic picture, in this context of the kind of militarized countries that Ireland is now being expected to imitate, the relationship between military spending and jobs is fundamentally broken. So in the UK, in Britain and in the US, what we've seen is that since 1980, military budgets have actually grown in real terms. So we're often told about this idea that there was a peace dividend after the Cold War, you know, we're somehow defenseless and we need massive increases to military spending. It's obviously complete nonsense. If you look at the data in real terms, the British military budget has actually increased since that moment. Over the same period in Britain, the number of jobs in the military industry has fallen by more than half. In the US, while the military budget has increased by about $200 billion in real terms since 1985, you'll remember at that point they obviously had a very small military budget. Reagan was pursuing the Star Wars program, which was obviously very cheap. There was no money for the Pentagon. And now somehow it's even larger than the kind of absolutely gargantuan Cold War military budget today. Over that period, a decrease in jobs of more than 2 million. So jobs have fallen by about 2/3. And if you compare military spending from if you compare it to other forms of government spending, spending on education, health, green industries, it produces fewer jobs. So as a way of spending government money, it is particularly inefficient at creating jobs. And when you turn to the question of growth, you have bodies like the IMF, like the RAND Corporation, which is funded by the military industry. They admit that military spending does not produce growth, and in fact that it is inflationary, and that military contractors, these private companies that we've been hearing about, increase the costs of contracts as government demand for contracts increases. So we end up with these ludicrous further increases in military spending. And why does it not produce many jobs per pound or per euro or per dollar of investment? Why does it produce little growth? Well, we've been hearing about the demands of these private companies. Obviously, what it is very effective at doing is producing profit and producing value to shareholders. So if you look at the kind of the Anglo-American arms industry in particular, so countries in Britain and countries in the US, they're predominantly privately owned. In the continental European context, you have a bit more state ownership, but in the Anglo-American context, we're talking about privately owned companies, and they're owned by international investment firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, Capital Group. These are the same investment firms that are dominant across other parts of the privatized economy. And they basically benefit from payouts that go through to the shareholders of arms companies. So in the Anglo-American context, there is more money going out to shareholders at the arms companies than in companies in the rest of the stock market index. They're particularly good at rewarding their shareholders. And that's because obviously they're drawing money from government spending on these contracts, but also, as Leticia outlined, from all the support that they get from research and development. So if you're a military contractor, if you're an arms company, you're in a wonderful position because you get government spending to fund your revenue. You don't have to pay for much of your research and development costs. Those are paid for on your behalf. If you take the example of BAE Systems, they pay for about 15% of their research and development budget every year. Research and development budget is about £2 billion. So a huge amount of that is being paid by government contractors on their behalf. And if you look over the decade from 2013 to 2022, they were able to give their shareholders about £8 billion. So we're not seeing this defense dividend, but what we're seeing is a production of a lot of shareholder value and money that flows through to the financial sector as a result of government spending. And as I've explained at that kind of national economic level, this is a very poor strategy when it comes to the question of jobs and growth. But it does have an impact at the microeconomic level, at the level of workplaces. So while you'll see economic harms from money going from sectors that do produce jobs, that do produce growth, to the military industry, what you will see is that in some manufacturing workplaces and in other sectors that I'll describe, like tech and universities, workplaces do get transformed to kind of move workers from civilian sectors and into military sectors. So the three sectors I want to talk about briefly are the automotive sector, tech, and universities. And in the European automotive sector, what we're seeing is a crisis because it can't compete with China, and there is the potential of job losses. And in that moment, because European governments are not spending on civilian priorities, companies are turning to militarization, to military spending, to look for a solution. It won't be a solution. It won't save the jobs that are being lost. But what it does mean is that some workplaces are being transformed. So if you take the example of Osnabrück in Germany, there's a Volkswagen factory there that employs about 2,300 people. And at that factory, Volkswagen is currently in advanced discussions with Rafael, the Israeli state-owned arms company, to convert the factory to make Iron Dome products. I mean, it's obviously horrific in the context of genocide, but it's also absurd because what they're talking about is a military system that has no use in a European context. The Iron Dome system, so-called, is designed to prevent rocket attacks from within 70 kilometers of the border. I don't know who's firing rockets from within 70 kilometers of the German border, but it's obviously a perverse proposal. So you have those workers facing the prospect of being pulled into the arms industry. Renault, Porsche, Mercedes, those companies are following suit. And for workers who are further down automotive supply chains, for instance, in the Basque Country, you also see workers who are used to supplying these automotive companies now being forced to make products for arms companies because their supply chains are being transformed. In other sectors outside of the conventional manufacturing, you can see this transformation too. So as we've explained, obviously arms companies are getting all this research and development support. That comes partly in the form of money, but it also comes in the form of free work from universities. And universities are really essential to undertaking research and development work on behalf of arms companies. In the British context, what that looks like is this new Defence Universities Alliance, so-called. So what the Defence Universities Alliance will be is 20 universities that are being drawn into the project of national security, and basically the kind of memorandum of understanding that's been published by the British government says that they want to do two main things, which is to undertake research for arms companies and also to undertake training for young people to work for those arms companies. In the context of King's College London, that is one of the kind of most connected universities with the Ministry of Defence. is now set to merge with Cranfield University, which has its own airfield and drone manufacturing facilities and basically operates as an arm of the Ministry of Defense. So what you're seeing is people who work in the university context who are now being forced to train people for the arms industry or to do research on behalf of the arms industry. And finally, and we've heard a bit about it over the course of this forum so far, the tech sector has been transformed over the last decade in order to be a core part of the kind of transatlantic military-industrial complex. And I think it's important to note that that's happening in two ways. You have the big companies, lots of whom operate in the Irish context, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, that are increasingly taking military contracts. But you also have this very dark project that's being pursued by the venture capitalists that have historically supported Silicon Valley to incubate new companies, often weirdly named after Lord of the Rings terms, like obviously there's Palantir, but Anduril as well, that are kind of specialists within this military tech sector. And in the British context, this has become central to our industrial strategy. So the industrial strategy that the British government published last year, which was meant to be, how they interact with all industries, really focused on this military tech sector. They want to close the gap for venture capital investment in military tech with the US by half, which in practice means attracting these Silicon Valley investors into the British context, attracting these companies like Anduril and Palantir. They've set up a defense industry advisory group, which is part of the Ministry of Defense, but it's basically populated by representatives from the arms companies and from the tech companies, and also from venture capital, and they've even expanded their industry secondment in the Ministry of Defense to do this. So across Europe, what we're seeing is this tech sector that is being increasingly militarized, and obviously tech workplaces that are now becoming much more part of the arms industry. I also want to touch on how this is reshaping our climate and how this is reshaping the environment across Europe, because what we're seeing is a kind of transformation of state priorities that, previously at least there was lip service paid to a climate agenda by European governments, but now they're wholeheartedly focused on the project of hard power. So just to start, there's the direct emissions that are going to be produced by this transition in the European context. So this new NATO target, which as Sam described is completely arbitrary, it's made up, is going to result, just the additional spending produced by it, in a carbon footprint the size of Brazil over the next decade. This is a heavily emissions-intensive industry, and obviously the use of this equipment produces lots of emissions as well. But we're also seeing that research and development funding, that science funding that previously might have gone towards climate goals is now being diverted towards the arms industry. In the British context, we had a national wealth fund that the Labour government founded basically to seed the development of certain new green industries. That's now going towards military and dual-use production. And we also see the raw materials that are essential for green industries, the transition minerals, basically now being appropriated for national security purposes. To give an example of how this is happening in the US, the Pentagon is amassing a stockpile of transition minerals, which we've calculated would be enough to produce 100,000 electric buses. The Americans might have a better and more humane transport system if they didn't want to expand their war machine so much. Just to finish, I want to talk a little bit about the resistance to this process, because obviously what we're seeing is this hollowing out of our economies, this transformation of workplaces, this transformation of climate. But in many of the places I've mentioned, this is being resisted. So in Osnabrück, you have community campaigners arguing for a conversion of the Volkswagen factory to build public transport products rather than cars or indeed Iron Dome components. You have Google workers who are campaigning for union recognition in the UK, in Britain, and they're doing so with the demand to reject military contracts. At King's College London, the union branch there is campaigning against this merger with Cranfield University, and they're doing so because they've identified that that King's College London is going to have to pay for the deficit of Cranfield University in order to become this highly militarized institution. These initiatives build on a very long history of both trade union organizing but wider campaigns for economic conversion that look for a transition away from what's called the permanent war economy that in our countries we've lived under for a long time to an economy that's designed much more around social needs. And what that really requires is obviously there's this these workplace struggles, this trade union resistance, but it requires a mass coalition. And when it was, framed around economic conversion in the wake of the American war in Vietnam, it was a mass coalition. You had politicians, you had union leaders, you had civil society, economists, political parties uniting under these banners. And we're starting to see some of those mass coalitions forming in Europe as well. We've had in Belgium resistance to the new NATO target, which has been framed around resisting cuts to pensions and to the increasing military spending at the same time. And obviously we have here the very impressive campaigning that is going towards the defense of neutrality and resistance to Ireland being forced into NATO. So these coalitions, these mass movements are essential if we're going to safeguard our future. And it's wonderful to be here in a country that is so at the forefront of this work and this campaigning. Thank you.